Yeah, that's a really good analogy. And actually, that there's a lot of links in philosophy, but also kind of in the scientific literature around death and DMT,
Mm.
and DMT being in some sense, you know, there's a belief among some that DMT is in some sense where we go when we die, or is somehow related to that. And some scientists have pointed out the similarities between the near-death experience and the DMT experience. Though I argue in the book that I think, and this is a few people have argued this in a few papers, that actually it's a lot more similar to the alien abduction experience that people report, because, you know, with a near-death experience, people have like a white light and kind of, you know, loved ones around them. I think it's very culturally specific as well, the near-death experience. This is much more like, I've just been like taken to a different reality and there's all these entities. Right. But to your point, what is really important is being able to, like it talks about in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, in the Bardo, this like the world between life and death. Exactly like you're saying, you have to use discernment and mindfulness to navigate it, because, you know, there's all these angels and demons as well, and it's like something really scary, something really beautiful, and you can easily get either aversion to one or drawn towards the other, but that actually takes you off the path of clarity. It's very similar in some ways with the DMT experience, except that in the Bardo model, those angels and demons are, I believe, if I remember correctly, seen as sort of an aspect of self. There are all these different aspects of self. And while I believe that is true to some degree with the DMT experience, I think it's true to the same degree that like you and I are different people, in that I think these entities, and then there's a very good chance that they are independently arising and exist independently of human perception, so that they are, in a sense, real. But it's not as simple as, are they real, are they not real? That is probably the most meaty question of this whole study of DMT that a lot of people want to get to the bottom of. Scientific materialists, they don't really see anything in consciousness that isn't matter as real, so they'll say, oh, this is just your brain on drugs. Whereas the vast majority of people who experience DMT report that the experience is realer than real, and that they believe the entities are real. So that's very interesting. There's that tension that exists.
Oh yeah, I definitely want to talk more about that, and also gain your perspective on how your view of reality has shifted since this. But perhaps kind of as a precursor, so your motivation for doing this was curiosity, and it sounded like what you actually experienced was a little bit unexpected. Talk about what actually unfolded, and what you thought was going to unfold, and what actually transpired.
Yeah, so what I thought the experience would be like was like smoking DMT, but that for 40 minutes, which in some ways it was. But what was really different is that it was far more there. I had much more of a sense, like with ayahuasca that many people report, or psilocybin, that there was a sort of intentionality and a presence and a teaching in the experience. So I actually called it the teaching presence. I had a sort of dialogue with, don't know, aspect of my higher self, you know, me, my subconscious, the DMT itself. I think all of those things are kind of true at once, which is kind of paradoxical. And I like my first dosing, I remember specifically saying to Chris Timmerman, I was like, you know, I've spent years now doing therapy and participating in group work and leading workshops and doing men's work and really doing like looking at my ego and doing kind of, you know, it's heavy stuff. And I was I specifically said, which is such a silly thing to say. But I was like, yeah, I'm just kind of bored of that. I just want aliens. Is it
ever over?
Yeah, exactly. So I was like, you know, I'm kind of like, I'd like a little pause of that. I just want something really metaphysical. And then of course in my first dosing, you know, I had this experience of, you know, first encountering this kind of teaching presence, which was like, well, what do you want? And I was like, oh, I want, I forgot what I said, actually. It's in the book. I really, but it escaped me. It said something like clarity, and it was like, that's not true. That's not what you're here for. What do you really want? And I was like, oh God, this is intense. And then I said novelty, and that sort of opened something up. And then the experience wasn't into hyperspace, but was like a really deep emotional experience to do with my mother and our relationship. And I was just in this deep grief and weeping. And then at the end of it, there was a sense of these portals. I could go anywhere. And that same kind of teaching presence was like, you can go, like this DMT allows you to travel to all of these different aspects of reality, but you got to take your baggage with you, and your bags are wide open. Your emotional baggage is spilling out. So you got to pack that up, and then you can go. There's no bypassing here. And I was like, okay, well, I got some work to do again. So that was not what I expected. And then the subsequent dosings, they took place every 2 weeks. And the subsequent dosings all follow, they were really metaphysical. I mean, my big lesson was that there's no distinction between the personal and the metaphysical. They're interrelated, right? It's not, Terence McKenna used to say, like, oh, you basically leave all your biographical stuff and all your kind of emotional hangups, leave them at the door and go explore. I think that's fundamentally wrong. Like, I don't think that's how consciousness works at all. I think wherever you go, there you are, as Jon Kabat-Zinn, the mindfulness doctor, says. So the following doses, at least the next 2 doses, were very much around this theme of connection and intimacy and feeling my emotions, while also these wild entity encounters. I'm traveling through kind of hyperdimensional realms and encountering entities, some of which I could communicate with in really intense ways. Others were just completely inexplicable to me, and I have no idea what was going on with them. And then the final dosing, which actually happened, there was like a 6-month gap, because we were expecting 3 dosings and then the placebo. And that was like, they were like, guys, this is the study. And then they got in touch about 6 months later, and I was actually already writing my book. I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to, I was like, okay, I'm not sure the narrative is that strong with that as my final dosing, but it was kind of had a completion to it. So I'm like, okay. And then they asked if we wanted another dosing. And of course we all said yes. So that other dosing was the dose that they'd found the effective dose to keep us higher, plateaued for longer in a higher kind of state. And that was really, really profound, that dose. And I almost threw up in the first 2 minutes of it. And then it was just so intense. And I could feel all the scientists kind of rushing, you have a blindfold on and headphones. I could feel the scientists sort of like rushing around, and I actually wasn't so worried. I was going through very much like an ayahuasca process, where it was like, you got to let this out. You got to purge something. And I kept saying, like, I was like consciously resisting. I was like, I don't want to puke here. I don't want to puke here. This is like, I'm like strapped to a bed. I'm not strapped to a bed, but you're like down with cannulas in each arm, and you just like, you can't move very well. And it was just I was like, I don't want to actually puke. And I was like, okay, we'll just cough it out. And so I was like, kind of coughing. And then, after that, I just kind of went to a completely different dimension. And that wasn't so much around my own personal stuff. That really was around like exploring what felt and had the experience of like exploring the cosmos, and encountering whole ecosystems of entities. So I kind of got what I was looking for in the end. But I think like many things, it required having to put the work in of whatever was unresolved emotionally for me. And of course, there's always something unresolved emotionally in us. But at that particular time and place in my life, what I had to go through. So that was not what I expected at all. It was a lot more healing than I expected.
Thank you for checking out this clip. If you want to see the full episode, you can do so by going up here. I hope you have a wonderful day.